And moving from that to Canterbury was a rude shock.
So I wanted to start with a quite general question, and in some of your work you've made it clear that you value traditional practices and some of the social and spiritual goods they can bring to people. Can you tell us a bit more about that? Why are having such traditional practices a useful thing for society?
Most of us are helped, I think, by having a kind of shape into which we can put our experiences. Doesn't mean that it's a mindless repetition of habit, but I think trying to cope with especially very significant experiences, both celebration and loss and trauma, trying to cope with those just on your individual resources is quite hard work.
Right.
And I think part of the importance of ritual is, well, there's something I can do, there's something I can latch onto and kind of hook myself onto something solid for the bumpy ride. Right. You know? So it strikes me as very interesting that even in a society which is not particularly religious, as ours now isn't, people will still want to invent some rituals and revive some rituals, even if it's a matter of putting flowers at the site of a road accident, which is the example that's often used. Right. I don't remember that when I was a child.
Right.
Nothing like that.
Interesting.
No, this is I think 80s and after development. As we've got more alienated from some forms of traditional ritual, we've kind of quietly invented some new ones. And when you think of all the piles of teddy bears outside Buckingham Palace, Princess Diana's death, that's all part of the same thing.
Yeah.
So, yeah, it's the need to have something to hang on to, I think.
Okay, so as you mentioned, this, that we don't live in the most religiously orientated society. I mean, how do you see the church's role in keeping up those traditions, keeping up those frameworks for people to latch their experiences to?
Some people, I believe, will always want to belong to the church. They will be convinced that that is how reality is. That's where they want to live. That's where they want to belong. That's where I'm coming from. Others will say, I'm not quite sure about whether that's it or whether I want to live there, but I'm quite grateful that there are some structures to slip into from time to time, that somebody's thought about the words to say at these moments, rather than just leaving it to me.
I would add, over a number of years.
Over a number of years. And I like the idea that in some ways the church is there partly to be an open door for people to find something of that.
Right.
So I think in an ideal situation, they're not universal, but in an ideal situation, the presence of a church in a community is a way of saying, look, there is somewhere to take some of these important moments and some of these difficult emotions. And we won't ask you to sign up to kind of membership conditions, but we will be there to give a bit of a handhold as time goes on. And I see this at local level. I'm living in Cardiff. Of course, in the last week, we've seen a colossal explosion of frustration and anger in a very deprived community. I suppose about a mile from where we live and part of the same parochial family.
Right.
And it's interesting that, unsurprisingly, the parish priest there has stepped forward and opened the church and been around in the community. Same with Grenfell a couple of years ago.
Yes.
That appalling tragedy. That was an event when people of all faiths, commitments and none, I think, were quite grateful that there were people there whose job it was just to keep open the door into a bigger frame of reference.
I mean, so Grenfell is an excellent example of where the church can provide that kind of role, but it's also an excellent example of the fact that we clearly live in quite a diverse London, or a diverse Britain more generally. And so it does introduce the idea of what are the relationships between the church and other religious institutions, non-Christian religious institutions? What are the interfaith relations that can support this kind of work?
At grassroots level, they've been quite fruitful, I think, in the last, say, 20 years, certainly when I was Archbishop. More of my time than I expected was taken up with interfaith events, building coalitions, building networks around the country. The Christian Muslim network nationally, which was meant to be just for local churches, local mosques, getting together for a bit of socializing, a bit of local advocacy, identifying local problems they could work on together. And it's at that level that the most constructive relations go on. Also, historically, there's the Council of Christians and Jews in the UK, which is a very significant body. And with resurgent anti-Semitism in our society, that's an area where Christians, Jews, Muslims, and others all really need to pull together much more than they're doing, I'm afraid. So I felt very encouraged by the levels of cooperation. And thinking back again to the time when I was Archbishop, when the Iraq War was just about to begin, I think it was quite important that we were able to get together the Roman Catholic Archbishop, a very senior sheikh from the Muslim community, the chief rabbi, a couple of other people, to make a statement together as, I don't like the term faith leaders, but you know what I mean, as sort of senior figures in our religious communities, expressing together our anxieties about what was going to happen.
Yeah. And I suppose this, as senior figures in your respective communities, I mean, you're going to be involved in talking about all sorts of things, right? Not just faith practices and not just where people can find value in your respective faiths, but I mean, one of the biggest issues facing us today is, of course, climate change and the future of our world as we know it. And you have in the Extinction Rebellion handbook that was released in 2019, you wrote the afterwards. So you've involved yourself in this question. What led you to make that sort of public involvement?
Not the easiest decision, because I don't think I'm an instinctive lawbreaker, really. It's probably just as well. But the feeling of frustration that I was sensing around, the feeling that the time had come for some more challenging public witness as part of a general strategy. I thought it's just essential for people to hear this, because we're building up to arguably the greatest crisis in historical memory. As regards human presence on the planet. We're walking towards the precipice, as they say, and we're finding lots of excuses for not doing things, both at governmental and at personal level. And I thought, well, anything that raises the profile. I think since then I've had my doubts about some of the tactics that XR used, and Just Stop Oil likewise. I think there's a point at which you're going to be alienating the public you want to get on side, and you've got to factor that in somehow. It's tactics, and you really have to check from time to time, just check in and say, am I speaking a language that's going to be understood, or am I just annoying people? Because that'll give you a great sense of discharging your moral responsibility. But is it actually going to change anything?
Is it going to help?
Stop and think. So a rather pragmatic attitude, I suppose, to that.
So maybe now we could take a more biographical turn. So you've done a range of actually very, very different jobs in your time. So I wondered if you could tell me, maybe give us some insight into what it was like going through the experience of being Archbishop, and then being the Master of Magdalene College, of course, and then now moving towards spending more time on your own research, I suppose.
Well, in respect to the last, I wish is the response I'd give there. But, yes. I think in retrospect, the happiest time I spent in my professional life was being Bishop of Monmouth in South Wales. A very, very satisfying, nearly 11 years of that, where I felt I had wonderful colleagues, wonderful support, a growing family, a sense of belonging in the community. And moving from that to Canterbury was a rude shock, to be honest. Suddenly you're up there in the spotlight in a very different way. Even though I'd been Archbishop of Wales for a couple of years, it doesn't compare. And I've sometimes said that one of the most difficult things about being in that sort of position is that you're always talking to everybody. So you make a remark in one context, and suddenly it's a fixed public position that is on the front pages of the newspaper. You write an article in the diocesan newsletter in which you make, this is a real instance, you make a casual allusion to a television program. Suddenly your attitude to this television program is news. I want to say, give me a break. So there was that. Also the fact that the time I was Archbishop was a time when the Church of England and the Anglican churches worldwide were going through a period of colossally bitter and difficult controversy, especially over gender and sexuality questions. And being in the crossfire of all that wasn't a great pleasure. But you live with that. Somebody's got to be there. Somebody's got to do it. And I thought that my job was to try and keep people at the table as long as possible, conversing. But of course that disappoints everybody. The ones who want change say, you're not pressing hard enough. change, and the ones who want nothing to change say, you're giving ground to the people who are going to tear it all up.
Yeah.
So, interesting time.
And those diplomatic skills that I imagine you developed, were those useful in your role at Magdalene?
Magdalene felt far more of a cooperative atmosphere.
Right.
I was very lucky. I think being head of a college in Oxford or Cambridge, I've sometimes said, can be either the worst or the best job in the world.
Right.
I was fortunate. I found it the best. Again, excellent colleagues, the real pleasure and stimulus of being with students, the diversity of conversations you'd have over meals and just casually, the opportunity to get back to doing some supervision of research students,
Right.
really brilliant research students. But yes, some of it carried over in the sense that if you're head of a college, just as if you're Archbishop, your executive power is very limited. You can't snap your fingers and people will jump to it. You snap your fingers and you give a firm bit of leadership and people say, no. Especially the people who talk about the need for firm leadership.
Right.
Give us some leadership, they say. You say, well, do this, and they say, over my dead body. So you have in both those settings to try and work for a kind of consensus, not in a flabby way, I hope, but try and get to a point where everybody can own what's happening. And you sort of look around the room and you say, now, can everybody at least sign up to where we think we're going with this?
We chose this together.
We chose this together.
Yeah.
And not exactly cabinet responsibility, but are we happy enough to go forward from this? Not perfectly happy, but is this enough to work with?
Right.
And getting to that moment and holding on to that moment, it's a challenge. But as I say, I was lucky in having wonderfully cooperative colleagues and actually being part of a college which valued community, which valued belonging together, and which in my time was really developing in terms of its outreach, its inclusivity, its diversity. And to watch that happening was a delight.
And so your time since Magdalene,
Yes.
I said your time to do more research, but
And
this
I
seems
said
not to be
in
so.
your dreams, yes.
There's research to be done. There's poetry to be written. What have you been spending your time on?
Bits and pieces of writing, but a lot of ad hoc writing. A lecture here, a review article there.
Right.
And a bit of teaching, more regular teaching for student clergy. But in these days when, of course, numbers of clergy are down and there's a lot to be done, I get a certain amount of pastoral work to do in the local parish and the local diocese. There's been that. Also, I was asked, rather to my surprise, to be involved with the, the Independent Commission on the Constitutional Future of Wales for the Welsh Government.
There you go.
Looking at what the future is for devolved government in Wales.
Yeah.
Do we have enough devolved powers? Should we be looking for more? If so, which ones? So that's a 2-year job of work.
Right.
And I'm slightly hoping that when we get that off the table at the end of this year, I may be able to get back to more writing of my own.
Right.
A couple of things I'd like to get done.
A couple of things you'd like to get done, perhaps on Eastern Orthodox.
Well, I managed to get a book out on that a year or two back, which, although it was mostly stuff I'd written earlier, I was glad to deal with. But I'm still fascinated by 2 areas which I want to write a bit more about. One is social ethics, Christian social ethics, and the idea of solidarity as an element in the Christian social vision. Pope John Paul II said somewhere, I think, that the Christian idea of society depended on the ideas of dignity, solidarity, and subsidiarity. The dignity of human individuals, solidarity as a virtue, in other words, we're all involved in each other's fate, and subsidiarity, taking decisions at the appropriate level, and empowering local communities. And I've done a few lectures on that. I did some lectures in Rome on that last year, and I'm wondering about trying to pull that together. And the other thing is still working a bit on the frontiers of theology and literature.
Brilliant, brilliant. Well, Rowan, thank you very much. I think that might be all we have time for.
It's all right, you're very welcome. Thank you.